I am a medical student, and here is how I use AI to study. So to preface all of this, I typically study by deep processing information using mind maps or some other form of notes, and then I typically follow that up with flashcards and reteaching, and various other forms of interleaved retrieval. A lot of these techniques that I'm about to cover are going to be based on that study method. And a link to that, as well as some details about it, is in the description. However, even if you're not already deep processing your notes or using a similar method, I think some of these tips might help you. So let's first start with how I use AI for learning, which is, as we know, the first half of studying. The first thing I always do when I start a new subject is I ask ChatGPT to give me an overview. Why is this important? The first reason is that when I'm covering a lot of content, which is, all the time in medical school, I find it really easy to get lost in the details and lose track of why certain things are important. Being able to orient myself with AI from the get-go is really helpful for keeping my head on straight and just understanding what's going on instead of trying to figure it out as I go. And that helps me stay focused and have a clean knowledge structure. And secondly, like I mentioned, I do use mind maps quite a bit to process this information, and so having that initial understanding forms a decent backbone that I can build off of. So once I do the overview, I'll typically start watching lecture. Now, when I say lecture, I'm not referring to the recorded lectures by my professors. In fact, I, along with most students, typically don't use our in-house medical school professor recorded lectures. The reason for that is, first of all, there's so many benefits to a pre-recorded lecture. For example, I can watch it on a higher speed or a lower speed. I can pause it when I need to, and I can skip material I already know. On top of that, while medical school professors are great researchers or physicians, they're not the greatest teachers. And that's why most medical school students end up using third-party professors who really find teaching to be their passion. And that really does reflect in the quality of their videos. So a typical service we use is Boards and Beyond, but I remember even in high school and college, I was using stuff like Khan Academy and other videos on YouTube. So how does ChatGPT help during a lecture? Well, what you'll notice is a lot of these third-party lectures are often quite short. And while that's a good thing, it means that they end up missing a lot of information that provides context to the problem at hand. And they do that because it saves time, and oftentimes it is unnecessary or out of scope to understand that information. However, that can lead to confusion. And so whenever I'm confused, I just ask ChatGPT immediately about more details on that situation. And that does take a little bit of initial time investment, but it ends up saving me quite a bit of time in understanding and memorizing this in the long run. Now, a lot of people instinctively know to do this, and it's a pretty obvious tip. So I'll just add on one little piece of advice, which is to preemptively tell ChatGPT to keep its responses brief. Because if you don't do that, it's going to go on and on and on with out-of-scope content, and it's probably going to take up more time than it deserves. Okay, so that's pretty basic. But this next part is a technique I haven't really seen anyone else talk about, but I think it's really powerful, and that is the method of loci. So let's talk about what the method of loci is. The method of loci is a way of associating information with various imagery and other more memorable things to make it more understandable and have higher retention overall. Some people know this as the mind palace, which is a relatively popular technique. Honestly, I didn't use this at all throughout high school or college. But once I got into medical school, all my seniors told me to use this in a form of a service known as Sketchy. So what Sketchy is a method of loci system done at a professional level. Here's an example of a sketch that I remember using earlier on in medical school. And this sketch is about a vitamin called niacin. So the first thing you'll notice is that you don't actually see the word niacin anywhere in this picture. But what there is a sea creature here. And in the sketch, this is described as a Loch Niacin monster. One of the common effects of not having enough niacin is a disease called pellagra. And that disease typically presents with dementia, death, dermatitis, and diarrhea. And you'll notice that there's a pelican down here, which seems to have all those symptoms kind of built into its image. So it has this little question mark shaped thing on its head, and it just looks confused overall. So that gives us dementia. Then it has diarrhea pretty clearly. And then you can also see it's having some skin issues here. So that's dermatitis. And then it looks like it's on the way out. So there's your death. On top of it, you can also see it has a pretty thick tongue, and that's because glossitis or tongue inflammation is also presented with niacin deficiency. And having all of this in picture format just makes it more memorable. So it's really easy to forget that niacin causes diarrhea, dermatitis, dementia, glossitis, and death. But it's really easy to remember a sea creature with a pelican that has all these, physical ailments. Now, that sounds great and all, but I noticed a few issues with this method. The first thing I noticed was that it just took too long. A lot of these sketches would be anywhere from 20 to 30 minutes, and they would try to teach the physiology and pathology while also creating these memorization aids simultaneously, and I didn't like that. I preferred to learn the material properly and then use this technique to memorize certain key details. And the second issue I found was that it was just too wide of a scope. If you look here, there are 23 different pieces of imagery for different details. But the thing is, for different people, different pieces of information will be more or less memorable. So the information from the sketch that I need a memorization aid for is going to be different than the information you may need a memorization aid for. And so the fix of this back in the past was to create your own. Now, this is obviously frustrating because it takes an incredibly high amount of time, and it's also difficult. You need to practice art or be naturally talented at art in order to get any sort of good results here. But this is where chat comes in. Now we can generate our own images, and it actually works out really well. And so a good example of this is back when I was studying something called metabolic acidosis, specifically high anion gap metabolic acidosis. I wanted to remember some of the causes of this disease. I had most of them down, but I couldn't get down alcohol, iron, and aspirin, no matter what I did. I would continuously miss these flashcards. And so what I ended up doing was I had ChatGPT develop the first image that came to my mind when I thought of these three things in conjunction, which was Dr. Doom with his iron mask, drinking a pint of beer while having some aspirin tablets on his table. And even to this day, I still remember that image and those causes of high anion gap metabolic acidosis super well, because that image is very clear and burnt into my mind. So now let's talk about revision. So a lot of people have already posted their ideas about different ways you can use AI for revision. So some people use it to make practice questions. Some people use it to make practice questions similar to the practice exams that professors give and other things in that field. I personally don't do that just because I find that I have enough material already. I don't need more practice. But what I do is I use AI to find gaps. What does that mean? Most people don't understand that when they miss a question or they screw up some form of retention, it's not due to only a knowledge gap. A lot of times, it's due to a misunderstanding or a fundamental poor level of encoding of the baseline knowledge. Now, I always struggled with this problem because I was just too lazy. It's quite difficult to, when you're doing a practice question, muster up the discipline to relearn that entire section of material when you get it wrong and correct any misunderstandings you've had. So many of the times I would just say, okay, I got this wrong. I need to remember this fact and move on. However, with AI, you can just make this so much easier and find the gap by telling it your thought process. And I'll give one more medical example to kind of solidify this, but again, you can apply this to any field of knowledge. We recently learned about a hormone called aldosterone and its effects on a electrolyte called potassium. And aldosterone causes a decrease in potassium. But when I initially learned this, I didn't register this properly, and I actually formed the opposite understanding. And the reason is, to a smaller extent, aldosterone does increase potassium reabsorption. However, this increase is not significant, and it's often overshadowed by this larger decrease it causes. Now, because of this misunderstanding, even though I kept seeing the flashcard that said aldosterone decreases potassium, I kept getting it wrong because my fundamental understanding of this subject was screwed to begin with. And so when I finally just showed the flashcard to chat and said, this is what my flashcard says, but this is why I keep getting it wrong. I think that aldosterone actually does this to potassium. It was able to identify that gap in my knowledge and tell me, well, actually, no. While it's true that it causes some reabsorption, the net effect is an increase in secretion of potassium. And that is just a huge time save because instead of going back and rewatching an entire 30-minute video on aldosterone's effects, I was able to type one sentence into an AI model and get an answer. So that's pretty much how I use AI to study. I think it's helpful. I think out of all of these, the biggest impact things you can do are to focus on getting a good overview, making your own little sketches to help retain information, and really finding knowledge gaps. This lecture stuff is cool and all, but it's pretty obvious. But overall, I think implementing these tips will definitely make you study faster. All right, go do your work.